Power in the Ottoman world was dazzling. Think grand mosques, bustling markets, scholars at court. But the machinery that kept that world in order was cold, efficient, and unforgiving. Justice in the Ottoman Empire was about more than just courts and codes. It was also about sending messages. The penalties were designed to correct the offender and to caution the crowd. They were part law, part theater, and always a reminder that the state's reach extended into every street, barracks, and border posts. Take, for example, blinding. For crimes the state regarded as dangerous betrayals, acts of treason, or rebellion, travelers like Evliya Çelebi recorded that such sentences could be carried out in public squares. The purpose was not spectacle for its own sake, but deterrence. To take away a person's ability to challenge authority sent a precise message. You are no longer a player. Others should not try to be. Some punishments, however, were more final. The empire resorted to swift executions when crimes touched the very foundations of security: mutiny, grave betrayal, or violent offenses. These events were conducted with ceremony and efficiency, meant to show resolve rather than prolong suffering. Crowds gathered because the event was public and the state wanted it remembered. Not every penalty aimed to end a life. Falaka, or striking the soles of the feet, was used across the garrison schools and households to discipline without permanent injury. Its effectiveness lay in two things: sharp pain that enforced immediate compliance, and the absence of lasting marks that might interfere with labor or duty. In a world where power was dazzling, justice was also stark. A constant reminder of the limits of power and the consequences of crossing those limits. When you think of the Ottoman Empire, what comes to mind? Perhaps its magnificent palaces or its vast trade networks. But what about its justice system? In the heart of Istanbul, a story unfolded in 1420 that would send shockwaves through the empire. Sheikh Bedreddin, a revered jurist and mystic, had led a movement that challenged the social and economic order. He had inspired the Sultan's enemies to defy the authority of the state. For the Ottomans, swift and decisive action was necessary. So the sheikh was captured and executed in Serez. The message was clear. Defiance would be met with the full force of the law. But that's just one story. During the height of the Ottoman Empire, executing captured leaders or rebels became a spectacle of war. The severed heads of Ottoman enemies were paraded through the streets of Istanbul, a grim reminder of the Sultan's power. Even the threat of execution was enough to keep potential rivals in check. And then there was falaka, a punishment that aimed to break you without killing you. Soldiers, students, servants, no one was exempt from this brutal form of discipline. The soles of the feet were struck with sticks or rods, a pain that was both immediate and long-lasting. The severity of the punishment depended on the offense, from a few light strikes to a harsh beating. What made falaka so effective was its public nature. Soldiers would gather around as their comrades were punished, not just as spectators, but as participants in the spectacle of discipline. In the Ottoman Empire, obedience was not just expected, it was enforced. In the heart of Istanbul, where the bustling Galata Bridge meets the shimmering waters of the Bosphorus, there once stood a public square known as the Hanging Place, erected in 1831. It bore silent witness to a grim spectacle, the practice of public executions carried out by the Ottoman authorities. Hanging was another method the Ottoman authorities used to reinforce order, and it carried with it both familiarity and finality. Unlike other penalties, hanging unfolded in full view of the public at city gates, busy markets, or open squares where people gathered for trade and announcements. It was not hidden, it was meant to be seen. The crimes that could lead to such a sentence were varied: murder, banditry, desertion, or acts of open revolt. In each case, the punishment was intended to send a clear signal that certain boundaries were absolute. By staging the act in front of communities, the empire ensured that justice was not only carried out, but also remembered. The visual impact of the scene reminded onlookers that defiance had no place in daily life. There were variations in how the penalty was applied. Sometimes it was carried out in a simple, direct fashion. At other times, it was staged with additional ceremony, depending on the crime or the person involved. What remained constant was the lesson. Authority did not operate in silence. Its judgments were visible, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Amputation was another penalty within the Ottoman system. most often applied in cases of theft or violent disorder. It served both a practical and symbolic purpose. Practically, it limited an offender's ability to repeat the same crime. Symbolically, it marked the individual as a living reminder of the law. In a crowded marketplace, the sight of someone bearing such a mark reinforced the boundaries of acceptable behavior more powerfully than words alone could. These sentences were usually carried out in public spaces as well bazaars, town squares, or near religious centers. By choosing such locations, the empire turned punishment into community memory. For those present, it was an unmistakable lesson. Property and order were protected, and transgression would not go unanswered. The symbolism was clear. A hand or foot lost for theft was not only a personal consequence, but a social message. It declared that the community itself was safeguarded by visible justice. The individual became a warning embodied, ensuring that others would think carefully before following the same path. Both hanging and amputation demonstrate how Ottoman justice relied on visibility. Punishments were staged not for secrecy, but for spectacle, not in the sense of entertainment, but in the sense of lesson. They worked through public memory, ensuring that the message of law and order rippled outward from each event. This focus on public memory is what bound the empire's legal system together. Punishment was never just about the person on trial. It was about the community who watched, the stories retold afterward, and the way those stories influenced future behavior. Justice was not written only in legal codes, it was performed in marketplaces, at gates, and in the very spaces where life unfolded. Through these measures, the Ottoman state reminded its people that law was present everywhere. To disobey was not only to risk one's own fate, but to provide a cautionary tale for neighbors, family, and strangers alike. In the fading light of a setting sun, the square fell silent, the echoes of the gavel resonating through the quiet streets of Istanbul. And so the story of the hanging place serves as a potent reminder of the intricate relationship between justice, memory, and the spaces that bear witness to history. In the grand theater of the Ottoman Empire, where power was a game of intricate balances, the Sultan's punishments were a deadly serious affair. Among the most severe penalties in their vast repertoire were castration and impalement. Punishments so extreme, they were reserved for the rarest of occasions. When we think of historical figures like Genghis Khan or Vlad the Impaler, we often picture ruthless men who commanded massive armies and struck terror into their enemies. But how did these titans of history treat those who dared defy them? How did they make an example of rebels so that the memory of their punishment would serve as a warning to future generations? Well, let me tell you, their methods were as creative as they were cruel. Among the most feared punishments in the Ottoman system was castration. This penalty was rarely used, making its application all the more terrifying. You see, in a society where male lineage was everything, to be castrated was to be denied the very essence of what it meant to be a man. It wasn't just about bodily pain, it was about severing the ties to one's past, present, and future. To be castrated was to have your name erased from the family tree, to be forgotten in the bloodline. This made it a punishment that cut deeper than skin, a punishment that echoed through generations. But even this gruesome penalty had its limits. In the darkest corners of the Ottoman Empire, where rebellion was met with unforgiving force, there was another punishment, one that was even more terrifying. And if you've ever heard of Vlad the Impaler, you might have caught glimpses of this gruesome practice. Impalement was the ultimate punishment, a fate worse than death itself. It was a form of capital punishment, a spectacle designed to strike fear into the hearts of those who witnessed it. The condemned was typically tied to a stake and left to die slowly and painfully, sometimes left to the mercy of animals or the elements. It was a form of execution that blurred the line between life and death, leaving the victim in a state of horrifying limbo. And while castration was a punishment reserved for the guilty few, impalement was a more flexible tool wielded by the Ottoman rulers. It was used on the empire's frontiers to intimidate local populations or in moments of intense rebellion. To understand its impact, we need to look beyond the pain and suffering it inflicted. Impalement was a performance, a public display of power and dominance. The very act of watching someone being impaled was intended to create a lasting impression, to remind people of the consequences of challenging authority. Now, Whether or not these practices were as widespread as some chroniclers claimed is debatable. But the Ottomans weren't the only ones who employed such tactics. Neighbors like the Austrians also used similar methods, each adding their own flavor to this grim tradition. And it's this mixture of fact and legend that makes the story of these punishments so fascinating. We may never know the full extent to which castration and impalement were used, but their presence in history is undeniable. They were not just brutal methods of punishment. They were tools of power, symbols of authority, and instruments of fear. They were the ultimate expression of a ruler's dominance, a reminder that no act of defiance, no matter how audacious, would go without consequence. The Ottoman Empire's punishments were brutal, from swift executions to the more corrective measures like falaka. It's a form of corporal punishment where the victim was stripped, tied up, and beaten with a whip. And in some rare cases, castration or impalement. These punishments were never isolated incidents. They were part of a system. Each punishment had a role. Some incapacitated, some corrected, some removed the threat entirely, and all carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond the person condemned. What united them was visibility. Justice was staged in marketplaces, at city gates, and military camps. Crowds gathered not just to witness a sentence, but to absorb a lesson. The condemned became examples, and their fate was transformed into a warning. A thief punished in the square discouraged theft across the city. A rebel leader executed after defeat reminded others that even influence and reputation could not shield someone from imperial law. The memory of these events traveled further than decrees or court records. It lived in stories, warnings, and the daily caution of subjects who knew the state's reach.